Chapter 14, Fire and Death. It was Mrs. Breen's last day at the factory, and from early morning a quiet sadness had been hovering over Hilda. She was thinking of Chicago, and more especially of Stillwell. Her friend would soon be so near her home. A blind impulse to send greetings tugged at her heart, but greetings to whom? Two graves in the cemetery rose before her eyes, the one covered with green grass and with a stone at its head. That was her mother. The other grave, still fresh with the imprint of feet about it, that was her father immediately after the funeral. Stillwell, beautiful Stillwell. Would she never see it again? Would she be stumbling her way up dingy hallways to top floors of tenements all her life? Would she always be going up 10 stories high to her work? Would she be cooped up in New York the rest of her days? Would her feet never touch the soft earth again? Or was it all a dream? She stopped her work and ran her eyes over the entire length of the loft. Alas, 'twas no dream. The shop was throbbing, bursting with energy. It seemed to Hilda that she had never before seen the machines racing at such speed. But she recalled that it was Saturday. The hundreds of employees were winding up the week's work, and the wind-up was always feverish. She was waiting for the whistle in a neighboring factory, which was the signal for the stopping of the machines in their own. She was impatient for the day to be over. Immediately after supper, she would take the child and go over to Ada. She meant to spend every moment she could spare with her friend in those last few days. She was waiting for the whistle when a piercing cry suddenly lifted Hilda out of her chair. It was as if the engine of a train had dashed past her. But it was no engine, no train. What it was seemed impossible, unbelievable, could not be. But it was. The place was on fire. The shop was burning. The paper patterns, silks, voiles, lingerie were burning. The wild shriek was coming from the breasts of hundreds of workers. It was but an instant from the time Hilda heard the shriek until she took in the situation, but the instant seemed like an age. The fire had in that instant grown twice, 3 times. A third of the loft was on fire. The floor, the ceiling, the walls were burning. The machines were burning. The fire was eating up the materials in the bins. It was licking up the remnants under the machines, chairs. It was crawling up to their feet. It was sweeping over their heads. There was a stampede for doors, for elevators. Frantic leaping over machines. A crashing. Arms, breasts, shoulders were driving onward, forward, and meeting with resistance from other arms, breasts, shoulders. Hilda was caught in the midst of this swaying, screaming, agonized human mass. Suddenly, through the sea of shrill, maddened voices, she heard her name. Someone was calling her. Hilda! She recognized Ada's voice. Her friend was calling her. She tried to turn around in the direction from which she thought she heard the voice come, but her body was wedged in. She was in a prison. Only her head she could still move. Ada, she called back. Ada, Ada. And then she caught sight of her friend. They were only 3 feet apart. Their eyes met, but only for an instant. The next moment, Ada had been pushed to one side. A dozen bodies, heads, had interposed between them. But the instant sufficed. She had never seen any human being look the way Ada did. She had never seen such eyes. Eyes that had known such terror could not live. There was death in Ada's eyes. She would die. She would die. Were her eyes like that too? Would she, Hilda, too, die? Yes, she would die. They would all die. She would die together with Ada. She would. The mass of people that held her as if in a vice suddenly became as soft as butter, while her own elbows, head, shoulders felt like steel. She was hewing her way. She had hewed her way through. She was outside that mass. Where was Ada? There was no Ada. The crowd had carried her off with it. The crowd was now like a brick wall. Hilda was outside that wall. She would never become mixed with it again. Ada, 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 she shrieked until she felt her eyes bulging. It was useless. Hundreds of voices were shrieking precisely as her own. They were calling names of children, parents, brothers. She would not find Ada any more. She would die alone. She would die. Raymond, her child. What would happen to Raymond? What would become of him? How he would wait for her tonight. What would his waiting end in? She would never come. He would never know. Never remember her. Nothing. It would all end in nothing, as if she had never lived. Never lived. Someone was choking her. Smoke, hot smoke. But her arm, who was gripping her arm? Who? Mrs. Walsh. Go? Of course she would go with Mrs. Walsh. Why was Mrs. Walsh dragging her so? Wasn't she coming? She was coming. A door. They were in front of a door. They were pounding, pounding, pounding. Would it open? Would it ever open? It opened. The elevator had come. Would they all get in? Would she be among those who got in? What if she did not get in? Her poor baby. They were moving. The odor of smoke ceased. Cold air, light, the street. They were in the street. A policeman guided them to the opposite sidewalk. There, Hilda stood still. She was waiting. She wanted the officer to guide her furthermore, but he had already dashed back into the burning building. She had recovered her thoughts fully. Yes, she knew exactly what had happened. The factory was on fire, but she had been saved. Little Raymond wouldn't be sent to a home. Yes, yes, saved. But there was no time to waste rejoicing. She must find Ada. Fire engines were clanging, coming. She had never seen so many fire engines in her life. They were roping off the street about the building. She was pushed back. She must go over to the main entrance. That was where Ada and the crowd must be. They would come out that way. She made a rush for the main entrance. The firemen wouldn't let her pass. Someone was advising her to go around. It was the only way to reach the main entrance now. She ran around the block, 2 blocks, 4 blocks. Finally, she saw the front of the building. Here there were again ropes. She got to the very edge of the rope. The police were spreading a net. Other men jumped in and volunteered to hold it. The net was ready. It was for the girls, the men, who were on the ledges clinging to window sills 10 stories above ground. The police were making signs to them. They were shouting to them to jump into the net. A young girl gathered her skirt as if she were about to cross a puddle of water and jumped. Things became dimmed before Hilda's eyes. Was she at a circus? Was all this mere play? A shout came, a shout of terror, horror in the eyes of the people about her. The body of the girl had broken through the net and was lying on the curbstone, with head split in 4 parts. Another body came hurtling through the air. Voices were shouting above not to jump. It meant death. But the girls, the women, the men on the ledges did not hear, did not wish to hear. They were jumping, their bodies striking the cold stone pavement with a loud cracking of bones. Hilda ran. She was without hat or coat. Evening was falling, a raw March evening. She did not feel the cold. In the elevated train, all eyes were fixed on her, but it didn't matter anymore. The whole world didn't matter. She wept as if there were no people about her. A neighbor volunteered to sit up with little Raymond until she came back, and Hilda, after feeding the child and putting him to bed, started for Ada's home. The place was dark, but in the hall several women were standing. Mrs. Breen had not come home yet, the women informed her. She asked about Willie and was told that a sister of Mrs. Breen and her husband had been over a few minutes earlier and had taken the boy with them. They had left their address. Hilda took the address, but instead of going to Ada's sister, she went back to the factory. It was 10 o'clock when she reached it. All the side streets leading to the building were packed with ambulances. The fire was in check, and search was now going on in the ruins for the dead. The bodies of victims were being lowered from the 10th floor in rope nets. Were there many people burned? A man standing alongside of Hilda asked of another. About 200, they say. Hilda felt that she was sinking, but quickly gathered her strength. That was no time to lose oneself. She even mustered up courage and inquired where the ambulances with the dead were going. To the morgue, she was told, and was given instructions how to get there. In front of the morgue, hundreds of parents, sisters, brothers who had missed their relatives were standing in line, weeping, moaning. Hilda went up to a policeman, told him that she was missing a friend, and wanted to know how soon she would be permitted to search for her among the dead. "Did you work in the factory too?" the officer asked. He was a man, close to 50, probably had daughters of his own. "Yes," Hilda said. Her mouth was twitching. "Wait here a moment." The officer spoke softly. "The sergeant is coming this way. I'll ask him. He'll probably know something about it." The sergeant knew. They had taken out of the building 125 bodies thus far. They expected that there were another 50 there. Many of the victims were in awful shape, and it would be 4 or 5 o'clock by the time the bodies would be in condition for identification. Hilda thanked the officer and went home. She went to bed without undressing. A dim light was burning in the room. She was gazing at her child, and suddenly little Raymond's features began to grow, distend, and the child was not little Raymond at all, but Willie Breen. Yes, little Raymond was Willie, and she, Hilda, was not Hilda, but Ada Breen. It was Ada who had saved herself, and she, Hilda, who was dead. Little Raymond was in the nursery, sleeping restlessly, and would be taken to a home the next day. Poor little Raymond. Poor dead Hilda. She jumped out of bed, turned the gas up, and then went to the sink and washed her face with cold water. Had she been dreaming? Had her mind been wandering? At any rate, she would not go to sleep any more that night. It was 2 o'clock. She would wait another hour and then she would go to the morgue. Her child always slept through the night soundly. She would take a chance on his not waking this time, too. She reached the morgue a little after 4. The line of relatives was passing through the gate into a big warehouse which had been converted into a temporary morgue. The regular morgue could not hold all the victims. Hilda was among the last to enter. People were walking along the walls, searching the long lines of dead, examining the bodies, holding consultations, hoping that the charred and disfigured human beings before them might not be the daughters, sons, mothers they sought, slowly coming to the realization that they were, and sinking down beside the bodies in mute agony or raving despair. She recognized Mrs. Breen's mother and sister. They were standing in front of something on the floor. Something. Hilda put her hand to her eyes. No, it could not possibly be Ada Breen. It could not. Ada. But it was.